by the Economic Society of Australia, and in particular the Women in Economics Network. My name is Christine Williams, and I'm the chair of the Women in Economics Network in Queensland. I'd like to begin tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm speaking from West End in Brisbane, and West End is part of the greater Kurilpa Peninsula, Kurilpa meaning place of the water rat, and that was the name given to this area by the traditional owners of the land, the Turrbal and Yugara peoples. Tonight's proceedings will be recorded and made available in the next couple of days on the ESA Central website and also on the WEN YouTube channel if you'd like to share it with others. Or indeed, if you get called away to attend to children, dogs, cats or whatever during the webinar. I'd like you to encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask questions of the panelists as the discussion proceeds. There will be ample time at the end for your questions. And please use the upvote function if you want to bring other people's questions to the top. So tonight's focus is on GDP. And GDP was certainly the focus of much discussion last week when the national accounts revealed the extent of the decline in economic activity in the June quarter. But is GDP really the best measure of economic well-being? Robert Kennedy in 1968 said GDP measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. Perhaps an extreme view. But ever since GDP was adopted as the agreed measure of economic performance in 1944, there has been much debate as to how appropriate GDP is as a measure of economic well-being, and indeed what should be included in GDP. In 1959, Moses Abramovich stated that we must be highly skeptical of the view that long-term changes in the rate of growth of welfare can be gauged even roughly from changes in the rate of growth of production. But what alternatives are there? In 1972, Bhutan became the first country to set as its aim not to increase GDP, but instead to increase gross national happiness. In 1990, the Human Development Index was created as an alternative measure of economic well-being, and I'm sure the panel will be discussing this measure. In 2008, the then President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, convened the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress with the publication of the influential Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report in 2009, and that created even more interest in alternative measures. More recently, in 2012, Kate Raworth in Oxford developed the concept of the donut economy, which takes into account several environmental, societal, and health indicators. This culminated in 2007 in the publication of a very popular and indeed very readable book, Donut Economics. The concepts in donut economics are being examined by economists and planners across the world to see how they can be applied in the post-COVID-19 world. The Dutch are using this approach to reshape its post-pandemic economy, as in Costa Rica. And if anyone's interested in looking at that, the BBC have got a very good summary of this work on their BBC Real site. So GDP is perhaps not the be-all to end-all measure that it may appear to be from its focus in the newspapers. And tonight's panelists are very well qualified to discuss this topic. First, we have Jacqui Jones from the ABS. Jacqui is the person who has the invidious responsibility of producing the GDP estimates for Australia. She's the General Manager of the Macroeconomic Statistics Division. Her background is survey methodology and economic statistics, and prior to working at the ABS, she worked at the UK Office for National Statistics. Susie Morrissey is a research associate with the Public Policy Institute at the University of Auckland. And while at the New Zealand Treasury, Susie worked on the Living Standards Framework used as a basis for New Zealand's wellbeing budget in 2019. Susie's a gender specialist with a background in tax and policy. Chris Fleming is the director of the Griffith Institute of Tourism at Griffith University, as well as being a professor of economics who teaches, research, consults, and provides public policy advice on economic determinants of well-being and the sustainable management of the world around us. So Jacqui, can you start things off by telling us more about GDP and what the ABS is doing to complement and supplement this important measure of economic activity?
Thanks, Christine. So I just wanted to start off by saying that what I'm going to go through today, these are my views and not necessarily the views of the Australian Bureau of Statistics. I just want to put that caveat on it. So my proposition, I'm going to put three things down on the table. So first of all is, what is GDP? And thinking about GDP, that it's about production. So as Diane Cool states in her book, GDP, A Brief and Affectionate History, GDP is growth, so nothing is deducted. It's domestic at home, and product, things that are produced. It does not try to be anything else. From my perspective, using GDP as a single indicator of economic well-being is like wearing your Jimmy Choos on your hands, not really what they're designed for. But GDP is a useful indicator for economic growth, and economic growth is linked to social welfare. So I want to look at that a little bit more. The second thing I want to look at today is I want to try and promote the full suite of integrated national accounts, as there is incredible data in the accounts that can assist with understanding economic well-being, and also highlight some of the development work and other ABS information that's available in this space. And then thirdly, I want to emphasize that economic well-being is about all sectors of the economy. It's not just about households and individuals. And as played out in the global financial crisis, the economic well-being of sectors such as the financial sector can be equally important to society and to the economy. So looking first then at the first point. So GDP is one of the many actual or derived indicators in the national accounts. There are many useful indicators such as final consumption, gross capital formation, the saving rate, the investment rate, and the government budget deficit. And it's interesting to note that the Stiglitz report does not recommend a single well-being metric. And I would suggest there's a place for GDP in relation to economic well-being, as economic growth is a key contributor to our well-being. The Stiglitz report and OECD conceptual well-being framework recommend looking at income, consumption, and wealth, and all of these are included in the National Accounts Suite. So looking at the National Accounts Suite then, I'd really like to try and get people excited about them and really unlock the potential of the information that's contained within the full suite of national accounts. There's a book called Understanding National Accounts that was published by the OECD. And in the foreword of that, it states that today, more than ever, national accounts remain at the core of modern system of economic statistics. The global financial crisis outlined, and I would add the COVID pandemic, the importance of timely, reliable and comprehensive monitoring of economic activity, and also pointed directions for new development and extension in the accounts. The foreword goes on to say that the questions, however, are whether users are sufficiently aware of the richness of the information contained in the national accounts and fully exploit their analytical and statistical potential. So when we talk about national accounts, it's not just about quarterly national accounts. We also have annual national accounts, and then underpinning the national accounts, we have the supply and use and input-output tables. And there are also associated products that the ABS produces. So for example, we publish a balance sheet for household sector, and on an annual basis, all the sectorial income, capital and financial accounts, as well as the household income accounts by state. The suite of national accounts contains a vast array of information that can assist with understanding the macroeconomic well-being of different sectors of the economy, for example, households, government, private non-financial corporations. And more detailed supply and use and input-output tables provide opportunities for more analysis. One of the benefits of the national accounts is that they're also broadly comparable across countries. So at the summary level, what national accounts provide us with is an overarching international framework for measuring macroeconomic activity. And this is via a sequence of integrated accounts, the accounts of production, income, capital and financial, as well as opening and closing balance sheets and other changes in assets. And at this summary level, the accounts reflect key economic flows of production, income, consumption, investment and saving. They're available, as I said, quarterly and annually. The quarterly counts focusing more on growth, with the annual counts more on levels. So if we have a look at the latest release of quarterly national accounts for the June quarter 2020, what we can see from it is that, yes, GDP did fall by 7% compared to the March quarter, but we can also see other valuable information. So looking at households, what we saw was that their income increased by 2.2%. They spent less, 12.1% compared to the March quarter. And this actually resulted in a household saving to income ratio increasing to 19.8%, which is the highest rate since June 1974. And looking at the government response to COVID-19 through subsidies such as JobKeeper and boosting cash flow of employers, the subsidies rose to record levels, and this resulted in general government net saving being the largest negative outcome on record, minus 82.6 billion. So hopefully that illustrates that, there's a lot more depth of information within the national accounts. But obviously the limitations are it's looking at the macro picture and you don't see how different households are actually being impacted. Looking at the more detailed level, the national accounts are designed to present a statistical picture of the structure of the economy and the detailed processes that make up domestic production and its distribution. They're underpinned by supply and use tables and the more detailed input-output tables. And both of these sets of tables provide a means of undertaking detailed analysis of the process of production, the use of goods and services, and of the income generated in this production. The ABS supply and use tables include 67 industries and 114 products, which are actually used to balance on an annual basis 3 measures of GDP that then provides the annual benchmark for the quarterly, annual benchmarks for the annual national accounts, and then the levels for the quarterly estimates. These underpinning detailed data sources are really useful for developing satellite accounts. So for example, the ABS tourism satellite accounts use supply and use data as an important input into its compilation. And more recently, the ABS has used the supply and use tables to actually compile digital activity estimates by taking a digital product approach. So again, there's huge utilities in these tables that can be unleashed. So one of the criticisms of national accounts is its production boundary. So national accounts are based on the International System of National Accounts Manual. And the production boundary is defined within that manual. And it's the activity carried out under the responsibility, control and management of an institutional unit that uses labour, capital goods and services to produce outputs of goods and services. There are different types of production, so production for sale, own use, or made available to others for little or no costs. The output has to be valued, and the added value of the production process to the value of goods and services has to be considered. So therefore, you need producing units, you need products, and you need prices. I want to give one example of how we're trying to improve the national accounts to ensure that we maintain the relevance of them. And so, like other national statistical organisations, we're always constantly striving to improve and maintain the quality of our national accounts in terms of data sources and methods. We're at the moment doing development work for the measurement of non-market. So non-market economic activity occurs when goods and services are provided free of charge or sold at highly subsidised prices. The ABS defines the industries of healthcare and social assistance, education and training, and public administration and safety as being predominantly non-market in nature. These 3 industries are estimated to be around 17% of the Australian economy and support just under 3.8 million jobs. These industries are of great importance to the Australian community as the services they provide directly affect the lives of many. So with government funding, we're developing improved measures of the non-market sector. The central problem is lack of meaningful prices, and this prevents difficulties in valuation as well as aggregation. We've recently published a conceptual paper outlining some of the challenges and also a conceptual framework we're using to improve non-market measurement. And at the end of September, we'll be publishing experimental estimates for schools and universities. Just highlighting some of the additional sources that the ABS produces that's relevant to economic well-being. Then we publish data, a lot of data on income, consumption and wealth outside of the national accounts. For example, we publish annual household distributional analysis, which uses annual national accounts data and data from our survey of income and housing to compile the analysis. We obviously produce data from our survey of income and housing, which collects valuable information on sources of income, household net worth, housing, household characteristics, and personal characteristics. We run a 6-yearly household expenditure data, which provides very detailed household expenditure data. And then periodically, when a time use survey is undertaken, we do valuations of unpaid work. So my third point in terms of economic well-being is about all sectors of the economy. The national accounts provide valuable information for this. The global financial crisis demonstrated that a build-up of risk in one sector of the economy can have widespread ramifications. Australia was less impacted than many other countries, but what we did experience was economic growth slowing, an increase in the unemployment rate, large declines in equity prices, which reduced the wealth of Australian households by nearly 10% by March 2009, and a depreciation of the Australian dollar. All of these impacting economic well-being. I lived through the financial crisis in the UK, and on the back of the UK impacts, further improvements were made to Bank of England reporting and national accounts data to capture the flows and stocks of financial derivatives alongside the counterparty information. Therefore, maintaining the quality of national accounts is absolutely essential for all sectors of the economy. So just to conclude, I'd like to go back to Diane Coyle's book. In it, she summarises that economic growth is a key contributor to our well-being. Without economic growth, there'd not be enough jobs to keep the unemployment rate at a tolerable level. And for now, there's no alternative to using GDP to measure economic growth. And it does a good job of measuring how fast or not the output of the economy is growing, noting that GDP growth is closely linked to social welfare. Diane says that national statistical offices should either do regular time use surveys to measure the informal economy or develop other measures of household production. And lastly, she states that some economists are concerned that the budget cuts at national statistical offices are making it harder to maintain the quality of national accounts. And these economists regret the diversion of resources to indicators such as happiness. So I'll stop there. I would like to take this opportunity, Christine, for thanking you to organising this panel, and I've very much enjoyed being part of it. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm glad to have you here. Susie, do you want to make any initial comments?
Kia ora koutou. Thanks, Christine. Thanks, Jacqui. Yeah, I'll just make a few brief comments in response to Jacqui's outline, which was fantastic. Thank you. I guess just a couple of points that are really worth picking up on. Firstly, the time use surveys, just the richest source of data for us, and really difficult to get a sort of strong sense of what we're actually doing with our time and how we're utilising the time that we have as the finite resource that we do have. It's absolutely essential to have that data. So really important to kind of keep that conversation going, and so right about the pressures that stats organisations are under in terms of that. So we haven't had a full time use survey conducted since 2009, so data that came out in 2010, and That's New Zealand have decided to put a briefer, shorter sort of time use survey as a supplement to another survey that they do for the next round. So we're not going to have all of the data to correlate back to the previous round, unfortunately, and the number of people, the types of people that will be captured are also different, as we'll lose those young adults. So just really important to kind of have that data and also that consistency of data so that we can have those conversations about where things are. So that's just one news that it's one thing that I was thinking of. But yes, as the Kiwi representative here and listening to all of that talk about productive time and unpaid work, I have to acknowledge the wonderful Marilyn Waring and her work from 30 years ago now that kind of set many of us off on this track of really trying to acknowledge all of the work that we do undertake. And I think we've probably grown more aware of that kind of thing this year. We've been at home, we've all been baking bread, and we've all been trying to grow things in the garden, and maybe we've been exchanging things with people on a barter system that we might not have used before. And we might have found ourselves volunteering, even if it's not perhaps formal, but just that seeking out our neighbours and making sure that people are all right. So we've got all of these, what I would want to call productive activities going on, and I'm sure we'd all agree that they have value. To pick up on the elements that Jacqui was talking about, and that there are products involved. And then, of course, we get to that question about pricing and whether it's possible to put prices alongside some of these things. So if I just outline the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of production, then obviously we've got reproduction, the key productive activity that we need as a society, and also breastfeeding that's alongside that. I mentioned food and growing and making your own food and volunteering. And so the question is whether these sorts of activities should be included alongside. Some people will say that they should be, that we should be using pricing that we can take from the market for volunteer time. There's probably people there are often people that are getting paid for doing the same job, so we could use that as a price point. For growing, for vegetables and food, we've also got other prices that we could refer to. Reproduction is a tricky one, but then also we do have actuaries amongst us who also value human life. So none of these things are impossible to do. The question is simply whether we wish to. I'll acknowledge the work of Julie Smith, who's done a lot of work on valuing breast milk and the contribution that would make to GDP if that was included. So you might not agree with all of these different elements, but there are certainly other things that could be included if we were ready to have a conversation about how we might price them. And I guess the other thing to think about is, what about those activities that we're doing that is actually having a detrimental effect on our country and its current output and its future output? So that might be the use of non-renewable resources, for example, pollution that we're doing, deforestation, those kinds of activities. So again, another question there about whether it makes sense in terms of thinking about what the country has produced to also ignore some of the things that the country has done, which will have a challenging, if not negative, effect on what it's able to produce in future.
And I think that's a part of the thing captured in donut economics, is that balancing of the environment versus the other. I think one of the fascinating things in terms of measuring some things such as looking after children, I think this year there's been a big switch in terms of the formal versus informal, as childcare, number of people employed in childcare probably dived a bit during that lockdown period, the first bit, and parents took over the prime responsibility, and yet none of that would be captured in the economic accounts, because you would look as though you're having a drop in production of that sector, but in fact it was still going on. It was just being done by the parents, who, not necessarily willingly in some cases. Now, Chris, you've got a very different approach to your views about GDP, so maybe we'll hand over to you. Now, Chris does have a slideshow he will be taking us through.
All right, thank you, and bear with me while I get this sorted out. Hopefully, if I pushed again, hopefully that's working for you guys, and you can see the first slide. Look, yeah, look, thank you, Jacqui and Susie, for kicking us off. I guess I'm coming at it from a position predominantly as an environmental economist, so I have some real concerns around GDP and the way it treats either the degradation of the environment or the use of natural resources and so forth. So to be fair to GDP, it was never designed to be a complete measure of welfare, and I think it's more about the way we've chosen to use GDP than anything about its fundamental design. Environmental economists and others, including Marilyn Waring, which Susie mentioned, have had a number of concerns about GDP as a measure of progress or a measure of welfare for a number of years. And as a result, we've been working, or a number of people and organisations have been working very hard on trying to develop alternatives. I think with a fairly mixed degree of success so far. And tonight, really, I just want to take you through a few of those alternatives and give you a little bit of a taste of what other people are doing in terms of, how do we create a more holistic and hopefully better measure of progress than GDP without needing, of course, to throw GDP out. So in terms of the alternatives, you can really categorise them into two camps. The first camp are a set of indicators that try to produce a single index, so a single number, up as good, down as bad, and in that respect, very similar to GDP. And I think one of GDP's powers and why it's been so persistent in terms of public discourse is it can be boiled down to a very simple soundbite, which journalists, politicians, and the general public seem to need. So up good, down bad, we can all cope with that. So I think there's some real value in a single indicator or an index approach. The alternative approach is to just present a suite of indicators. So say, look, there's a whole bunch of things that are important for well-being. It could be environment, it could be education, it could be income and so forth. And let's just present those as a suite. The issue with that is the communication piece becomes really, really complicated. So if I had to choose, I would always go for an index. The problem with an index, though, or one of the issues you have to overcome with an index, is if it's going to be made up of a suite of different indicators, you have to make a judgment call around how those indicators are weighted. So when you create your index, is education more important than the environment? Is income more important than education, and so forth? And if you look at what's being done out there, typically what people have done is avoid that question, avoid that value judgment by simply weighting each individual indicator evenly when they create their index. Which of course, there's no real economic theory to support that, and it is a bit of a cop-out, but I'm not sure if I have a better solution. Of the single indicators, you can think of a number of different types of single indicators. One, and perhaps where some of the thinking started, was the idea of taking GDP as the starting point and then adjusting it somehow. So adding in more good things or subtracting bad things. And that was, I guess, fairly famously put forward under an index of sustainable economic welfare by Cobb and Daly in the late 1980s. But when you sort of scratch the surface of what they're doing, it does feel horribly subjective, what they decide is good or what they decide is bad when they start augmenting GDP. And if you look at their early versions, for example, they decided that all advertising expenditure should be removed from GDP, therefore implying that all advertising is bad. And yet I'm sure we can think of examples without having to try and think too hard of where advertising can be positive or good for welfare. And to the very current example, I guess, the advertising and messaging around social distancing and how to behave during COVID is an example of advertising being used for good. Anti-tobacco advertising and so forth would also fall into that category. So it seems like a very subjective, arbitrary way to approach it. The idea of you can take good things add good things into GDP or take bad things out. Another approach is to use GDP as one of your indicators when you build up your suite of indicators to create the index, and that's quite a popular approach. And we'll look at a couple shortly of indicators that do that. And then some indicators ignore GDP altogether and just create their own set of indicators that are deemed to be important and put into an index. So I'll just take you through 4 examples. And the first one has already been briefly mentioned tonight, is one that has been around for possibly the longest of the alternatives. It was first put forward in 1990, it came out of the United Nations. It's very simple, 3 domains, so education, life expectancy, and income, effectively. So 3 domains, 4 measures. The domains are all weighted equally, again, avoiding the question of which one's relatively more important. Useful in that it has some of the really good aspects of GDP. So I think GDP's strengths are, A, it's a single number, up is good, down is bad, which is great for communication. B, we all do it, that is, most countries do it pretty much the same way, so they calculate it the same way, so you can make valid comparisons across countries using GDP. And also we've been doing it basically the same way for a good period of time, so you can look at data over time. So GDP gives you a really rich database to compare country performance over time and across countries. And the only alternative indicator that really exists at the moment that also allows you to do that is this Human Development Index, which, as I said, started in 1990, has been consistently measured and is consistently measured across countries, and is deliberately kept simple so that they have the data, they can find the data that they need to do it consistently or measure it consistently across countries. In saying that, the UN is also playing with variations of this basic index. They have an inequality adjusted one as well, and they also have indexes around gender development and gender inequality. But they have kept that core product the same, which is great for people who want a consistent time series of data. So I guess in the top right-hand column, or right-hand chart rather, you can see, who's performing well and who performs poorly in terms of the Human Development Index. But I think there are more interesting questions if you start scraping away at what drives the index or the development of the index. And so the table at the bottom right is comparing on the left-hand side, it's showing the rank of countries that are outperforming in terms of the Human Development Index than you'd expect given their ranking in terms of income. So it's basically saying the countries on the left-hand side rather of that table, Cuba, Georgia, and so forth, are all punching above their weight in that they are getting better development outcomes than we would expect if we looked at their income only. And so, for example, Cuba is 43 places higher if we rank countries by Human Development Index than if we just rank them by income. So there's something special going on in Cuba and Georgia and places where they're able to get more out of the income that they've got in terms of driving development outcomes. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, we've got the reverse being true. We've got countries where they're performing significantly worse in terms of their human development performance than we would expect given their levels of income. So, staggeringly, Equatorial Guinea is 80 places lower in its human development ranking than it is in its income ranking. So that's some of the interesting things we can start to tease out in terms of having, I guess, more framed, more holistic conversations around what do we need to do to progress as a society or as a nation. Another index that was briefly mentioned already tonight was the work the OECD have been doing. So they've been working on alternative measures or more holistic measures of progress for a couple of decades now. The Better Life Index is largely informed by that report that was mentioned, the Stiglitz-Senna-Fatoozzi report, which was commissioned by Nicholas Sarkozy. And that report suggested there are a number of things that are important in terms of better quality of life, and you can see the OECD have taken that information and converted it into this index of 11 different indicators. Again, they've copped out a little bit in terms of making the judgment call around what's relatively more important. So if you go to the Better Life Index homepage, they will give you an index for all the OECD member countries. They'll give you a score, but they will by default just rank or weight rather all of those different indicators equally. But what they have done that I think is really neat is they've allowed you, if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, they've allowed you as an individual to change those weightings. So if you decide, for example, that education is more important, you can move that toggle thing along and that will change the index by re-weighting the relative importance of the 11 indicators. So I played around with it a little bit today, and you can see in the table on the left-hand side, the far left column with Norway at the top, that's just everything weighted equally. So that's sort of the base case. If we decide education is the most important thing and we slide the toggle right along to the right-hand side for education and leave everything else where it is, then Australia jumps to number 1. If instead we decide that environment is the most important thing and slide that toggle to the far right, then Norway jumps to number 1. So again, it's about, for me, these indexes are about promoting conversations around the direction we're heading in as a society or as a nation, what we want to work harder on, what we might be failing on. And so although having a single index I think is really important in terms of communication, being able to get under the bonnet and look at what's driving the individual indicators and where we're performing well and where we're not performing so well, I think is a really useful, a useful thing to be able to do from a public policy and general public discourse perspective. A slightly more radical approach to measuring society's progress has been put forward by the New Economics Foundation, which is a progressive think tank based in the UK. They've ignored GDP data altogether in the calculation of their Happy Planet Index. Basically, they say what we're trying to achieve with progress is to live long, happy lives and have a minimal impact on the planet in the process. And so you can see from the diagram there, the index is made up on the numerator. We have life satisfaction, which they take from a 0 to 10 question about how satisfied you are with your lives. So they take national averages from the Gallup World Poll. The heart represents life expectancy, which they take from the UN, and then they adjust it for inequality of outcomes. So basically they look at the distribution within a country of happiness or life satisfaction, and also the distribution within a country of life expectancy. And so then they convert that numerator by a percentage point based on how unequal or equal the distribution of happiness, or rather life satisfaction and life expectancy is. And then they divide the whole thing by the amount of resources or the ecological footprint. And you can see when you do that, you get quite a different ranking in terms of the countries performing really, really well to what we would expect out of the UN HDI or the OECD indexes, where we see, Costa Rica, Mexico, etc., performing very, very well. Happy, long-living people who are living fairly lightly on the planet is the formula for doing well in the Happy Planet Index. The final one I would like to talk about before I pass back to Susie is an attempt by the Australian Bureau of Statistics to produce a more holistic suite of indicators to measure Australia's progress. It first appeared in 2013, 26 indicators over the 4 different domains, and in development of the domains, they did a lot of surveying of people to see what was important to Australians in terms of quality of life, and then they came up with this dashboard approach. And they've discontinued measures of Australia's progress. Jacqui probably knows more about the politics of why it's disappeared than I do, but one of the things I would comment on this approach, and I applaud them for trying to do it, but I think unless you get to the index, it makes the communication really difficult. And I'm just trying to imagine, sunrise, Channel 7 in the morning, trying to report the results of the latest round of maps. So we've got 26 indicators. Some have gone up, some have gone down, some haven't moved, and some we don't even measure yet because we don't have the data. How do you turn that into a press release? And I think part of the purpose of having a more holistic measure of progress is to promote conversation. And if it's too confusing and it doesn't get out there, the conversation is confined to people like me who are economics or stats geeks. And that's not the conversation that really needs to be happening. So I suspect one of the reasons behind MAPS's demise, and apart from budget cuts, is the fact that it never really grasped the public consciousness because it was just too complicated. They didn't measure everything that they even had in their indicator suite. and how do you tell a story on, you know, on Sunrise, which says some things are going up, some are going down, some haven't moved. What does that mean? What's the sum narrative that you need for those conversations? But anyway, that's it for me for now. I'm going to pass back to Susie, because I understand the Kiwis are even being more courageous, shall I say, and have promoted a 56 indicator measure of progress. So I'd love to hear a little bit from Susie around the thinking on that.
Sure. Wow. I feel like the weight of the nation is on me to explain what we're up to and hopefully make it sound convincing. Well, I spread this.
Can I just interrupt, Chris? Can we stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, I'm just trying to work out how to do that.
I'll just carry on and do that.
Yeah.
So the whole of the public sector will be joining me on this, but to various degrees. So let me explain exactly what New Zealand is up to. So you may have heard talk last year of the wellbeing budget, and when the when the Labor-led coalition government came into power in 2017 here, late 2017. They decided that they wanted to take a different approach to wellbeing, and they wanted to have a broader approach to considering what wellbeing was, and they wanted to use that as the basis for the budget decisions that they would later make to a certain extent in budget 28, our national budget I'm referring to when I say this, of course, as a non-state country. So our budget in 2018, but then the flagship product was the 2019 wellbeing budget. So what the government decided to do was to use the wellbeing measurement framework that the Treasury had developed. And the Treasury had developed what we call the Living Standards Framework. And as has been noted by someone on the chat, there is a lot of information online on the Treasury's website if you enter Living Standards Framework, and there's a lot of information about exactly what it is, including all of the domains and indicators, which I won't go through now, but all of that information is there. Similarly, if you look at budget information for budget 2019, you'll also see a lot of information there. So afterwards, if you want to go ahead and look at that, you can. But to summarise what Treasury had been doing, they had very much taken the OECD's BLI. So some people, as Chris said, you know, some people will like that approach. Some people will be concerned about its failings in terms of the lack of weighting. Some people, in terms of adopting that to use as a country measure for our unique Aotearoa, some of us found that challenging to do that because it didn't come from the country and the people itself. It's very much come from overseas. Now, for some people, we've talked a lot about comparability, and I've talked about time series comparability myself. But that international comparability piece, for many of us, it's a strong factor, and the benefit of being able to use something that we've got data for from across the OECD nations has a lot going for it. I will say, though, that it does mean that you lose the opportunity to bring out the uniqueness of your country, in my view. So the sorts of things that you might be measuring might of course be very important measures, but they might not be the most relevant for you. So my country, like your country, has a range of natural habitat, of original flora and fauna that you don't see anywhere else in the world. And so the idea of not measuring, for example, you know, lost habitat, lost animals, those kinds of things. For some, that's a very mark against such a framework. But other people will be very happy with the idea that we can assess how we're doing to other people. But to the point about no weighting and no up, down, bad, good as a summary piece, the Living Standards Framework does have not 11 like the OECD, it has 12 domains of current wellbeing. In an attempt to bring something of Aotearoa, we've included a cultural identity domain. And so that allows to pick up, for example, our Indigenous language, the amount of people who can speak Te Reo Māori. So it gives an opportunity to include a little bit. In terms of measures, there aren't lots of measures under that category, but the category is there. Another feature of the Living Standards Framework is the capitals. And again, within economics, we'll have lots of people that like a stocks and flows approach, and people who won't like it. And the capitals that are used are just the ones that the OECD uses. Also included is a risk and resilience as a concept. So that's a really interesting thing, I think, to consider at both an individual and a national level. Of course, very pertinent now in post-COVID times. How resilient are we individually in terms of our abilities to retain work or support ourselves if we're not in paid work, to retrain if necessary? Do we get support from the government to do that, especially if we're not straight out of school? So there's lots of really interesting, I think, questions in risk and resilience. Currently, we're not measuring that in New Zealand, but I think that's a really fruitful area for sort of consideration. So to the point that was mentioned about measuring things when you don't necessarily have the data for them. So there's a couple of places within the Living Standards Framework that people were interested to look at, but we didn't have good data. And I mentioned that we didn't have up-to-date time use data. So the measures that are up there are now quite dated, sadly. But also there are other things that you might want to raise. And I think it's really important to still recognise that some of the areas that you think are important, even if you don't have the data, because it's a bit of a carrying call. If you recognising this is an important area, then that's the way that we can start to trick us into debate and actually get the data we need. And we know, and Jacqui will know, it's a complicated process to do any new surveys or even new fields. And all of this is challenging, and it takes time and money and commitment. But nevertheless, if we're not recognising that we would be able to use them, then we're not so likely to get them. So that's the wellbeing budget and Treasury's Living Standards Framework. And we will be reporting on that over time, but yes, very difficult. We're not sure if we quite have the morning TV equivalent, but quite difficult even to get a 6 o'clock news story from a range of FIM 54 indicators. So, but it does mean that there are a range of different ones and that people will perhaps engage with different areas. I should also say that Stats New Zealand, the ABS equivalent, is also undertaking some work in this space. So they have what they call indicators Aotearoa, IANZ, indicators Aotearoa New Zealand. And those indicators are what I was referring to before. They have come from the people. They have come from a bottom-up approach, if you will. So Stats New Zealand undertook a very consultative process across the country to ask people what was important to them in terms of wellbeing. And they collated them under themes, and which are not the same as the ones that the OECD use. And they have constructed measures that they want to have underneath those. So I'll just read you a couple of those just because they're a little bit different. So they talk about things like social capability, culture and relationships. And they do use the word leisure, which is obviously a difficult word in feminist economics, but I'll leave it there. Economic self-determination, so capturing concepts that we're more used to, quite traditional work and income and wealth and housing. Quite a lot of focus on environmental sustainability, land, waste, water, air. So really showing that there's obviously a lot of desire from the consultation process to really be showing those things. And also a large section on Te Ao Māori, so the Māori worldview, including their beliefs and customs, tikanga. So a couple of different approaches going on in New Zealand at the moment, both of which will be reported on. Still both quite new. So in terms of, yes, I'm just thinking about whatever happened to MAP. So I really don't know how long they'll go. So they're new, and we'll see what happens. I guess the other thing to mention is that there's a element of or a risk, I suppose, of politicisation, because because it was so heavily adopted by the current government. I suppose there is a question about how long they last, and does a different coloured government, you know, by which I mean if it was a centre-right coalition type of government, would it still feel willing and able to use the similar sorts of things? So will we get that continued time data collections? So yeah, so those are the two things that your neighbours are up to.
Okay, well, there's one question coming that follows on just from what you've just said, Susie, and that is someone's asking the question, why is it important to compare against other countries? Surely what matters is how a country compares to its past self. So I think everyone's probably got an opinion on that, so I'll open that one up first.
They probably do. I'll give a quick response and then I'll see what my colleagues have got to say. Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. So at one level, really, all that's important is how we're doing, and if we're doing better today than we were doing yesterday. I think that's a very valid position to take. On the other hand, economic argument is that some people say it's hard for us to determine whether we're doing well today. We might be doing better than yesterday, but perhaps yesterday was particularly poor. And so only by comparing us with our with comparable countries can we really be sure that we're doing well. I don't think there's a right answer here. I think both are valid. But as I said, I would in my personal capacity, I do think that it's important to recognise the uniqueness of each country when you're doing this. So an internal focus does speak to me, but both are valid.
Jacqui, have you got any comment there?
Nothing really to add to Susie's in terms of, I think they're both, you know, valuable approaches for different reasons. And I suppose, I don't know what's the sort of the thinking behind the question is, you know, I suppose if you're trying to focus too much on international comparability, is that at the sake of what's kind of important to your particular country? But yeah, there's kind of pluses and minuses from both perspectives.
Chris, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, look, I think the risk of not having an idea of how you're tracking compared to other countries is we live in a world where capital and in normal conditions, people are incredibly mobile, right? So labour and capital can move around the world. And if you are, you know, falling further and further behind your nearest neighbours, as New Zealand has experienced in periods of its history, you'll see that capital and labour move. So I think it is important to have some idea. I totally appreciate that looking internally is good too, and having a nuanced local flavour to your measure of progress has its merits, but I still think you need to know how you're tracking against the rest of the world, because if you fall too far behind, you as we've all seen, the best and brightest may choose to pick up and leave and take their capital with them.
Well, one of the things I didn't hear too much discussion on was health, and one of the questions here is about health. Governments seem to be paying close attention to the importance of mental health during the pandemic. Where does mental health fit into these alternative measures of well-being? And do you think this heightened awareness of mental health might accelerate interest in these alternative measures?
Yeah, so in some of them, certainly in the OECD one, and in fact the Happy Planet Index, there was the life satisfaction measure. And there are, I mean, it's a very simplistic measure. It's simply a single question based on, you know, overall how satisfied are you with your life at the moment? 0 to 10, 10 being good, 0 being bad. But I guess it's a point in that direction in terms of mental health. There is some discussion in that life satisfaction literature that we should be paying more attention, not so much to averages, but to the proportion of people who are scoring very, very low. So how many zeros are you getting, how many ones are you getting? So some measures of dissatisfaction, if you like, and that can be an indicator of mental health. But yeah, so it's in there in a flavour through the OECD Better Life Index and through the Happy Planet Index, but not with any great depth. And I'm sure the psychologists in the room would be horrified at the way economists measure life satisfaction or happiness.
And anybody else about that? Just trying to see some of the other ones here. Jacqui, one for you. New Zealand's made available its wellbeing economy on the web, available for all to see. So do you know if there's any Australian governments or political parties developed anything similar? And if not, why not? So that's all those broad measures. I guess that ABS has a lot in terms of their satellite accounts, things that they have, but.
So as Chris mentioned, we did used to produce and publish the Measuring Australia's Progress. And it stopped before I came to Australia, so I'm not sure about the situation that led to that actually stopping at the moment. There doesn't appear to be any appetite to kind of follow the New Zealand approach. But again, that could well change depending on kind of what happens after COVID and obviously political interest.
Yep. So I've just got one here for me, and I guess it's about Susie, but the wellbeing budget, and it touches on one of the ones that have been asked. So it is one of the first economies that's gone down an explicit wellbeing budget. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the challenges that has brought about, and how do you actually go about linking the budget, the actual financial budget, to a wellbeing budget?
Yeah, so on a practical level, for the people working in government, one of the challenges was that the government was looking for cross-government spending initiatives. Now, I'm sure Australia is like New Zealand with its Department of Health and Department of Education and Department of all of these different areas, ministries, and the risk, of course, is that they all operate quite separately, and that that's a natural enough. But of course, a lot of these things are very cross-cutting. Health, for example, the various social determinants of health that come from education and housing, as well as the physical makeup. So there was a request made that for cross-government initiatives to come in, so for ministers and ministries to work together to produce bids to include in the budget. So that was a different way of working for both ministers and public servants, which I'm sure will continue and improve over time. The wellbeing budget was the first time that they really did it. In terms of how it kind of works into the financials, well, the way that our national budget is set is that the budget policy statement is issued around November, and in that the government gives an indication of the areas that it wants to focus on in the budget, which is handed down in May. And the way the budget policy statement was put together for the wellbeing budget was to look at the measures and the living standard framework and to see where things were not as high as they could be. And so that's how, for example, in this year's budget, that's how there was a lot of spending on mental health, to go to the question from before, because there had been seen, some of the indicators in there had shown that they weren't so well, and so there was investment made into mental health and also further investment into the Ministry of Health for other types of treatments. So that's how the link is made, looking to see where those indicators are not going as well or not as high as they could be, or over time looking at any reduction, or for example, and then coming up with policy initiatives that will help drive those. And actually, as I'm saying that, it occurs to me that it's a thing to note there, of course. It's an age-old adage, but what gets measured gets done. And so another risk to think about in all of this is if you've got the particular set of indicators and you're looking to see whether they move up or down, of course, the risk is that you focus attention just on those, or on something that you will get to move those quicker, maybe, so that you can actually see that progress. So I think that's just a human nature observation I'm making. It's no critique of any particular actors in this space, but that does, we've recognised this for a long time, that wherever you're shining that spotlight, you've got those incumbent risks of Are you taking short-term wins over longer-term improvements, and are you actually focusing on those at a loss of to focusing on something else that's equally important?
Anybody else want to comment on that? So there's the question here with a comment, interesting debate about alternative well-being indicators. And the point is subjectivity not a key problem. Different people have different opinions as to what to include, so this could be captured by different interests. So horses for courses. And it links to one that I was going to ask too, is this whole assigning weights, how you actually can assign weights if you're coming up with different sets of indices, given that we're very aware of how our values can subtly or not so subtly affect our opinion of what matters. So can I get your opinion on those things?
Okay, I think there's a few things to push on there. One is the separate indicators themselves, whether, for example, the OECD has the right 11, or should there be other ones added in there, mental health or more cultural specific indicators. So, yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, there is subjectivity in alternative indicators. And I suspect that level of subjectivity has been why people have been reluctant to weight them. So they've subjectively selected what we should be measuring in terms of the indicators, but the thought of weighting them is a subjective too far. How could we do it? Well, perhaps we could do it by democratizing it. And one of the things I didn't point out about the OECD's website is once you've chosen your relative weightings of the 11 indicators, you can submit those weightings to the OECD, and they get a little bit of socio-demographic data on you in the process. And so somewhere in the OECD, I assume they've got a lovely database of all these different relative weightings that people have put on those 11 indicators. And I'd love to see some research come out on that. But in terms of subjectivity, it's also true that defining welfare via GDP, i.e. via the produced goods and services that are traded in markets, is also a subjective decision. It's just a decision we've made for a very long time. So perhaps it doesn't feel subjective, but having that narrow frame is in its very nature also a subjective decision. So I think it's very hard to say anything meaningful in the policy space without venturing into subjectivity land.
I think one of the other things that bothers me a little bit is with some of these more value judgment type measures, how it's not it's not absolute, it's a relative sense of well-being quite often. So when you come to international comparisons, it gets very much more difficult. So what someone thinks as being, a good environment in Canada compared to Africa somewhere, it may be very, very different. So how do they get around that problem, Chris?
Well, I think it's bringing more people into the conversation, because I think undoubtedly where we've got to so far in terms of the UN's measures plus the OECD measures, and presumably also a lot of the other earlier measures about augmenting GDP, is it was all from a very Western mindset. And I think we've probably struggled to move beyond that. And then perhaps New Zealand with its 56 indicators is a step in that direction. But I have to say I have grave concerns about the sustainability of New Zealand's system, and whether it will get kicked out as soon as the other side of politics gets in, or whether budgets get tighter. But yeah, I agree. I think we've taken a very Western lens to the development of indicators so far. And it's about having broader conversations.
I might just make a response to that. The other thing about the indicators that we use is that they're generally very individual. So in New Zealand, within Māori and Pacifica culture, but also, it's also true in many other places around the world, in Asia and the subcontinent, that actually people operate in a much more of a family and intergenerational family, what we would describe as a whānau perspective, So if my sister is unwell, I am unwell. So and so very, so I think that's the other sort of Western perspective that we brought to this measurement, is at least thus far, it tends to be quite an individual focus rather than really examining that sort of family and community aspect, which is also something to think about.
I've got another question here that sort of links to this issue of indicators. How might indicators take into account current well-being versus future well-being? For example, the implications of climate change for future well-being.
I guess that was always the challenge of defining sustainable development, wasn't it? That it was development that meets the needs of the current without reducing the ability of the future generations to meet their needs. How you include that in an indicator? I mean, you could do it in terms of resource stocks, I guess. You could do it in terms of a simulative capacity of environments to deal with waste and environmental indicators around air pollution levels, water pollution levels, and so forth. So I think it would be a suite of, for me at least, it would be a suite of environmental and perhaps social indicators that gave us, maybe not the answers, but certainly prompted some conversations around where we were heading.
So this is another one for you, Chris. Specifically asked for you is what do you think would be the social environmental effect of introducing universal basic income?
I'm glad you defined UBI for me, because I was going, what indicator is UBI? I couldn't think. Okay, I'm glad you did that for me. Look, I have to say this is a little bit outside of my area of expertise. I haven't followed the universal basic income debate very closely. What I would say is it's very clear to us that inequality is a rising issue, and that the distance from the top 1% and everybody else is growing at a frightening rate and has grown further during the COVID-19. So I think there's some real need to find a solution to rising inequality. I think one of capitalism's biggest challenges now is that we seem to be concentrating wealth and power in an ever smaller number of people's hands. And I don't think that's sustainable in the long run. And I think if capitalism wants to take us forward, or some form of capitalism wants to take us forward, we need to figure out a way of redistribution, because I don't see how it can be sustainable for the 1% or the 0.1% to have so much wealth and so much power, and the bottom 50% to have so little. So without knowing the mechanics of the universal basic income, I would be strongly in favour of a strong redistribution policy. How you do that is way beyond my capabilities at the moment.
Has anyone else got a view on that? No?
I follow the UBI pilots in Finland and in Canada recently, and it's an interesting question. They're often posed as, or UBI is often posed as an option that allows people to work through transitions. So it's often pitched as something that will help to move through job loss or to voluntary or involuntary, to be able to give people a little bit more, financial support to be able to make change. Sometimes it's used in the context of caring, that it might enable people to make a decision to do that and provide some sort of financial support to do that. And these things all sound, meritorious. I think there's a question really about UBI, given that it would go to the clue is in the title there, that it goes to everyone regardless of need. And some people will again support universality within some transfers, or benefits, as you might call them, and some people may prefer that they are means tested. I think in Australia your old age pension is asset and means tested, whereas for example in New Zealand it's not means tested at all. It's universal for everyone and no testing. So we in fact already have a UBI in New Zealand for the over 65. So there's a pilot going on here for some time. So it's an interesting concept. People do talk about the withdrawal from the labour market or the reduction in supply in the labour market if the UBI was introduced. Certainly that's not the case of our over 65s. We have quite high paid work participation for them, even though they're getting it. Now, obviously there'll be a range of reasons why that's the case, but it's not possible to sort of, evidence would suggest that you can't give it a blanket. It will reduce labour supply participation. So I think it's multi-layered, lots to think about with UBI. But yes, if you're thinking about that in Australia, don't forget that there's one next for you to have a look.
There's one here that's probably for Jacqui, but other people can comment. In light of current debates about large global media platforms bargaining their service against your private information, is there any conversation to include privacy or lack of privacy in any of these indicators? Or any possible alternative indicators? I guess my sense is they're so highly aggregated by the time they're reported, there's probably not really an issue of privacy, but Jacqui, what would you say?
So yeah, from the point of what's actually produced in national accounts, and as you quite rightly say, it's so aggregated, and there's no kind of issues in terms of privacy. I suppose what's becoming more and more evident is that privacy is a kind of more of a debate when we're thinking about more data integration. So some of the source data that obviously comes from surveys and administrative data and is being integrated to provide really powerful integrated data sets. But obviously there needs to be some constraints around sort of access to those data sets and the analysis that's actually taken from those data sets as well. So just in terms of what the ABS does, we have a couple of integrated data sets, one for businesses, one for people, and we have quite strict arrangements around those where people can only access the data via a data lab, and they have to kind of go through authorization process to actually get access to that data. And obviously we check what's being taken out of the lab in terms of the analysis that's being done. So I think it's those sorts of issues that I think are more something that we need to be thinking about.
And there's another one for you here about how accurate are the numbers that the ABS produces?
What numbers are we talking about?
It's out of there, isn't it?
Very accurate, Jacqui, very accurate.
But it depends what numbers you're talking about. I mean, obviously, you know, surveys, you've always got some error around them because they're based on a sample. I think because if I just think about national accounts, because you go through this whole process where you're first of all producing the annual estimates, and as I said in my kind of pitch was that they're based on actually balancing at a very detailed level in the supply and use tables, kind of the economy. And then you're using those levels then on a quarterly basis to look at growth. And then you reconcile again every year, then they are pretty accurate. I think if you didn't have all those kind of checks and balances through the different annual and quarterly process, then obviously you could end up with some discrepancies.
And there's another one, which I guess for you best able to, if you can answer it. It's a hypothetical one, I hope. What would happen to GDP calculations if American dollar eventually collapses when it's used as the world reserve currency benchmark? Not quite sure I understand that one.
I'm gonna use my answer, which I used to use in media things when they asked me what the next GDP number would be, is if I had a crystal ball, it would be really good, but unfortunately I don't have one. So, but it's a good question.
I mean, it wouldn't matter in the first instance, would it? Because GDP is calculated in the domestic currency to start with. And so it would only matter in terms of how you compared it across countries. And presumably if American dollar wasn't valid anymore, you just use gold or the euro or cryptocurrency or whatever was chosen to be the yardstick, wouldn't you? I mean,
I think it's more, I was just thinking about the knock-on effects if that happened.
Yeah, I'd imagine there'd be fairly profound knock-on effects.
yes. Yeah.
GDP is not the thing I'd be worried about at that point in time. Western civilization. So we've talked a little bit about this one, which says when media reports GDP, should they not also report alternative measures such as HPI or GPI or others? I mean, I used to do a lot of the economic commentary for Queensland Treasury, and I can't imagine making it more complex, and we've made that point already. It's so simple, just have one number. But do you think that people should be more aware of the fact that there are other indicators? I mean, I'd imagine the general populace is fairly unaware of the fact that there's other things other than GDP.
I would love to see a broader indicator used alongside GDP if we're going to report our progress on Sunrise or whatever the appropriate medium might be. But yeah, I think the short answer to that question is yes. The difficulty, I guess, is in educating the financial sector journalists around and the general media around what's available when it comes out, making sure they know when it comes out, and making sure they understand how it's built. I mean, it's not actually that complicated for some of the, for the OECD index, for example, it's not that complicated. I managed to teach it, to take some of the stuff to high schools. So it's certainly possible. If there was a will, I'm sure it was possible. But I think it's back to that key of needing to have an index, because I think if we gave them, 26 indicators, for example, at once, it would end up on the cutting room floor, so to speak.
Can I just add something in terms of, I think it also comes down to how we disseminate some of these statistics as well. So when you were talking, Chris, I was just thinking about the ONS. I mean, they had a huge wellbeing program, and it was heavily funded by government. But what they actually started to do was include some of those indicators, and some of them were just kind of indicators that are actually already within the national accounts, like on the front page of the national accounts release. So it was trying to kind of not overemphasize GDP, is emphasize that actually there are these other indicators that you should be looking at as well. And as you touched on, actually educating journalists, especially in terms of, this is what these numbers are, this is how you should use them, these are the ones that kind of complement one another and give you that kind of more rounded picture.
Yeah, and particularly it would even give the chance to bring in some of those subjective type measures that we were talking about before. So to match something, not recognising Chris's point about the subjectivity of GDP, but assuming that that's a more objective one on a relative scale, it would be good to report some of the, the self-reported, the life satisfaction type data that we do have. Most jurisdictions are, have surveys that capture some of that sort of data as well. And I think that would be a really interesting juxtaposition, perhaps, if, what if GDP is going up but people don't feel any better? Which again goes to that point about inequality. If the GDP might be going up, but the benefit of that might only be going to a few, and therefore, a subjective measure alongside that might show you that that most people don't feel the benefit of that.
That reminds me
In Australia, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics Survey, or HILDA as it's more commonly known, does collect life satisfaction data from, I think, around 17,000 households every year, and has done since 2001. A few years ago, we did some work analysing the first 10 years of that data, so 2001 to 10. And that was a period where Australia was seen as the golden child of economic progress and growth relative to the rest of the world. But in that 10 years, average life satisfaction in Australia fell, particularly from female Australians. In fact, they drove almost all of the average decline. But what we did see at the same time, however, was much less dissatisfaction. So those reporting zeros and ones declined as a proportion over the 10 years. So it seemed, from as much as we could tell from the data, it seemed that the strong period of economic growth from 2001 to 2010 reduced dissatisfactions at the very bottom end of the scale, but the overall average was actually slightly lower. But yeah, would love to see it reported. And in New Zealand, it's the New Zealand General Social Survey, I think, asks a very similar question.
It does make you wonder about something like happiness and how people feel. I have to say, I was randomly watching SBS the other day and came across this very strange film. Not sure I'd recommend it, Hector and His Search for Happiness, which is a psychiatrist looking for how to achieve happiness. But I mean, Chris, you do research into the economic determinants of happiness. So how does an economist look at something as subjective as happiness? Economists are these dry people who do serious things that are objective, not subjective, surely.
Well, sometimes. Look, I mean, as you'd expect, I guess, from an economist, we look at it through data. So, the data set I just mentioned, I mean, it measures life satisfaction, not happiness, but happiness economics sounds so much more interesting than life satisfaction economics. So it's a single item question, 0 to 10, and very, very large samples, and it's measured in a number of household surveys across the world. And so a lot of the literature is simply trying to work out what are the drivers, what makes it go up, what makes it go down, and so forth. I guess some of the more interesting findings in that literature, certainly from the Australian data that we've looked at, is children make you unhappy, which I think we also kind of always knew. Children in the house make you unhappy. When they leave the house, you get a lot happier. Middle-aged men are unhappy. I mean, we kind of knew that. Unfortunately, for probably most of this audience, too much education tends to make us slightly less happy, which is something you often see in the more developed nations. But yeah, that's what we're doing. We're using those massive data sets to try and work out what drives self-reported life satisfaction, to be more technically correct. There are some more innovative ways of looking at it. There was a guy at London School of Economics many years ago, George McKerran, who developed an app called Mappiness, and then had people randomly, random times being asked to report their happiness and take a photo of where they were, and trying to work out about surrounding environments and activities and what that did for happiness. And he's published a little bit of work in that space. But that's mostly how economics is approaching it. As I said before, some of the psychologists are horrified at how simplistic our measures of so-called happiness are. But actually, they do stand up pretty well against more conventional psychological measures, and they do, happier people tend to display the traits you would expect happier people to do. So people who score well in that life satisfaction score do seem to behave in the way you'd expect, and obviously people who score less well on that life satisfaction question also behave in the way you'd expect. So there has been a lot of validity testing, as you can imagine, because there is a natural degree of skepticism among economists about whether we can measure such things.
Well, to be more serious, we'll get back to the serious questions from the audience. It's been shown that economic growth can be decoupled from CO2 emissions. Do you think social welfare can be decoupled from economic growth? And is this desirable? It's a tough one.
That is a brilliant question, and I don't know the answer. Part of me would like to think so. I mean, the environmental ecological economist in me thinks this endless pursuit of growth can't be sustainable on a fixed planet, and therefore we must be able to find a way of at least maintaining or enhancing our welfare without just making more stuff. So I like to talk about conscious growth. So not just growth for growth's sake, but actually really thinking about how we're trying to expand the economic sector. But I think the jury's out on the answer on that one still.
And I guess it comes down to measurement too. So there's a lot more focus on circular economy. And, so you're still producing, but you're producing with less waste. So how you measure then, if you measure comprehensively, you're getting better outcomes. And you will also have growth if you don't have the negative aspect of the waste taken off. But because we don't measure the waste, we wouldn't necessarily get that outcome. So I guess it really does come down to what is included and what isn't included. Jacqui, have you got any views on that one?
I mean, it's a good point. And when you were talking, it was kind of making me think about, when you first started having national accounts, the focus on the production of goods. And then you've kind of, we've over time recognised services. And so, yeah, where does it go from there? What other things do you start recognising? I can't comment on what kind of ends up being decided in that thing, but I think it's useful to kind of note that, the manuals that we produce national accounts on are updated periodically, and so these kinds of conversations will be included in debates, as we're trying to think about the next rewrite. My understanding is the next System of National Accounts rewrite is due to come in 2025. So there's a lot of debates going on at the moment about these sorts of issues. But it'd be interesting to see kind of where it goes. And at some point in time, I would very much presume that we would start including those things.
Because with the approach to the donut economy, which does have the negatives explicitly recognised, as you'd expect with a circular economy, if it does become a much bigger part of our economy, it's going to be really important to make sure you do capture the negatives, as well as the disproduction of waste, for example, rather than just the production of other things.
Yeah, I agree. And I can see a whole load of measurement challenges flashing before my eyes right now.
I'm glad it's you, not me. Well, I've got another curly one here. I'm not. Have we got any modern monetary theorists here? I don't know if I even understand this question. Has modern monetary theory affected the accuracy of the income factor? For example, GNI within the HDI index. Does it constitute giving income lesser importance in the overall means of measuring development and satisfaction? I think that question stumped me, and I think if it can stump you again, that's fine too.
It's got me stumped. Perhaps, Justin, you could reach out to me later and we could talk it through more, but I'm struggling on that one. Anybody else?
No. So we have one last question out here. And Chris, you mentioned concern about increasing inequality. Living Economies believes the manner in which money is created through interest-bearing debt contributes to this inequality and also negatively impacts natural resources. Have you considered the contribution of interest-free local currency systems to social and environmental well-being?
Simple answer to that question is no, I haven't. Thanks for the link. I've taken a note of it here. I'll definitely have a look at it. It's interesting, the debt question, because I guess that the counter argument is the idea of the Grameen Bank and the idea that what was keeping people in poverty was a lack of access to credit to do productive things, to grow business and so forth. And therefore, one of the solutions was to make sort of micro lending available to poor households, and then particularly to female-headed households. And that was seen as a solution to poverty. And then on the other angle, we have this argument here that the creation of interest-bearing debt is the cause of inequality and perhaps poverty. So I haven't resolved that in my own mind, actually, to be honest. I'll be quiet now and let somebody else answer.
Well, if you haven't got any more responses to that, we might think about winding up. We're coming to the end of our time. And I would like to thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very much to the panelists for their time and the intelligence in which they've directed themselves to the questions. I hope that everyone out there has learned something new or thought about things in a slightly different way, or both. I think that's the point of webinars, is to make you think. I'd like you to all consider joining the Economic Society and the Women Economics Network. And yes, the Women Economics Network is open to men as well. That way you'd ensure you won't miss out on more of our seminars and webinars in the future. And remember, this discussion will be available shortly on the ESA website and also the WEN YouTube channel. So we'll wrap up tonight by saying thank you very much and have a lovely evening.